Before we get into the Season 3 recap, if you need a Season 2 recap, just hit the tab in the upper right-hand corner. Or if you need a recap of the whole series up until this point, there's another tab coming shortly. Just wait for that one. Season 3 kicks off 3 months after the end of Season 2. But even though 3 months has passed, Leanne is still on edge. She tries to go about her normal daily routine, but Aunt Josephine is living rent-free in her head. There's also another issue. There's a lot of bugs that have gotten into her room. She goes over to the windowsill where there's at least 3, and she picks one up. Looks like a cicada. I'm not a bug guy. I don't know. But she clasps it in her hand, tries to revitalize it, but it doesn't work. She then gets dressed and goes to tend to Jericho, and Jericho is downstairs with Dorothy, Julian, and Sean. And those 3 are really excited because Jericho is going to try some of Sean's cooking for the first time. But all Leanne can focus on is the fact that a door is open. As both Sean and Dorothy start snapping photos of baby Jericho, Leanne goes over and slams the door. They reassure that nothing's wrong and nothing's out there, but she tells them, you wouldn't know what to look for anyway. Dorothy once again tries to reassure her by saying, if these people were after you, they already would have come. And you told us yourself that Aunt Josephine isn't coming back. But Leanne tells her that these people are patient and they'll worm their way into their lives and they won't even know it. Dorothy gets her mind off of things because the family is planning a trip down the shore. And this trip will be the first time that Leanne steps foot out of the Turner residence for a prolonged period of time in a while. This trip to the shore isn't the first time that the Turners have tried to get Leanne out of the house. In fact, they've been doing it just about every single day. Sean, Jericho, and her have been going on walks to the park, or at least walks to halfway down the block until finally Leanne just turns around and goes home. Sean, however, can't do today's walk. He's got errands to run, so he asks Julian to do it. And Julian is fresh out of rehab. He's ditched Natalie and has a new girlfriend named Vera who's planning on going to the trip down the shore. And he seems like he's in a good headspace, but that doesn't mean he wants to babysit Leanne. He tries to change the subject by telling Sean that he's gotten him and Dorothy a really expensive gift, but Sean gets it back on track by once again telling him, I need you to fill in for me and walk her to the park. And while those 2 are discussing the exciting trip to the park, Leanne is upstairs taking care of those dead bugs. But it turns out these 3 on the windowsill aren't the first 3. They're just one of many, because she takes that bug, puts it under a glass, and escorts it over to the medicine cabinet. And when she opens that up, there's a bunch of dead bugs in there, but they're all different kinds of bugs. She puts the bug away and gets ready to go on this walk with Julian, but she's still pretty terrified. She finds the strength, though, to start making her way down the street. The whole time, though, her head is on a swivel for attackers. As they're making their way to the park, Julian has something to talk to her about because it turns out these 2 have continued to have sex the entire time. Even with Julian having a new girlfriend, they continue to have sex. But Julian wants to break it off. He wants to try to do things differently. He wants to try to do things the right way. Leanne, however, does not want that because she knows that deep down that's not Julian. And she doesn't want him to be a fake. She also doesn't want to stop having sex with him because Julian's thrust game is a 10 out of 10. So while Julian tries to break it off, Leanne emphatically says no. She then notices that there's a guy standing in the street just staring at a car. She storms up to him, turns him around, but realizes that she's made a grave mistake. The guy's just a street artist. Julian pays the guy off, and Leanne hurries home with Jericho. They didn't make it to the park. Right before Julian steps foot back in the house, a piece of the facade falls off and almost smashes him in the head. Leanne then heads in and gets settled and heads down to the basement. Julian waits for that expensive gift to show up, which is a Peloton. When Sean gets home, though, he's not exactly thrilled to see it. Julian then fills Sean in on the fact that they didn't make it to the park and says that Leanne is downstairs. And the basement is still a big issue. That hole is still there, a swampy mess. It's gotten so bad that Sean had to contact the city to send out a guy to fix it. Now that night, right before Leanne is getting ready for bed, she stares at the painting that's in her room. And the painting is of a guy that's whipping a donkey, and it looks like an angel is trying to stop him. She stares at this painting for a while. But there is a hole right above the painting in the wall, and that is where these bugs are coming out of. And that happens to be the wall that directly behind it is the charred body of Aunt Josephine. She then goes to bed that night with a dagger in her hand. And you get the feeling that she does this every night. The next morning, everybody gets ready to go to the shore. Julian comes over with his new girlfriend, Vera, but Leanne just isn't ready to make that commitment. So reluctantly, Dorothy ends up leaving Leanne at the house, and the family heads off to the shore with Jericho. As soon as they're gone, Leanne arms the house and starts doing some chores. That includes getting rid of all those dead bugs. After that, she heads down to the basement where she gets a FaceTime from Sean. And immediately she thinks that something's wrong with Jericho, but he says, "No, I just called to check on you." Sean then notices that Leanne is back in the basement. And he also knows that she's been on edge for the last 3 months. So he gives her a wine recommendation that's in there and says it goes great with tomato soup. Leanne cracks open a bottle and starts drinking it. And with her journal in her lap, she can't find anything to write about. And this has been a problem. She's had writer's block. The weird thing is, she's trying to find inspiration right in front of the mud pit that's in the basement. That's not working, though. That is, until the mud pit starts bubbling up. And Leanne is looking at it horrified as she just starts scribbling V's. But they look more like when a child is asked to draw birds. When she snaps out of it, she grabs the wine and rushes upstairs. And then she gets into another glass of wine. And another. She ends up calling Toby, drunk, looking for a booty call. But Toby can't come over. He's helping a friend move. Right after she hangs up with Toby, she gets a FaceTime from Dorothy, and Dorothy just wants her to see Jericho at the beach. After showing her Jericho, Dorothy informs her that Julian was attacked by a bunch of seagulls. And when Dorothy relays this story, Leanne actually sits up in bed. She's mortified. As soon as she hangs up with Dorothy, she goes to grab her diary, which was left in the hallway. And when she picks it up, she sees what she drew, and it looks like a flock of seagulls. She then hears something over her shoulder, and it's somebody who's actually in the house. And since everybody that's supposed to be in the house is currently down the shore, she gets super freaked out. So she runs so far away, or at least to the closest closet. She FaceTimes Sean and lets him know that someone's in the house, and Sean says, "Well, hide and call the cops." And Sean then hangs up on Leanne and calls the cops himself. But Leanne doesn't. She starts tiptoeing through the house until she steps on a creaky floorboard and alerts the burglar that somebody else is in the house. It forces her to actually hide into the wall, the same wall that she hid Aunt Josephine, and she sees her charred body. But as she's hiding, she looks closer and notices that that charred body is covered in bugs, and those bugs start flying at her. It forces her to leave the wall. She realizes she can't evade this guy forever, so she ends up luring him into a closet and trapping him there. She starts demanding to know who sent him, who's in charge. But before he can even answer, she starts telling him how they weren't just reborn to be followers. They have their own path. At this point, the police have arrived, and as soon as the burglar hears the police knock on the door, he ends up bursting through the closet door, knocking Leanne to the side and escaping. A few hours later, the Turners arrive home to see Leanne still talking to the police, and the police let the Turners know that this is just a burglar that's been going around the city and waiting for people to leave on vacation so he could break in. Unfortunately for Leanne, the burglar had no idea that she was there. As the police are talking to the Turners, Leanne is upstairs looking to see if the burglar took anything, and she starts looking for the dagger, and it looks like it's gone. After the police leave, Dorothy knows she has to go talk to Leanne to calm her down. She lets her know that they're going to get security cameras, and this person was nothing more than a run-of-the-mill burglar. But it doesn't really make Leanne feel much better. In episode 2, the Turners did what they said they would. They install a very high-tech $6,000 security system in the house to make sure Leanne feels comfortable. But she doesn't. And that's because Leanne starts walking around noticing that Sean is making a whole lot of food. She asks Dorothy what's going on. Dorothy tells her that Sean was supposed to tell her. Sean completely forgot because he's cooking all the food. So they tell her together. They're inviting a bunch of people over. They've been on a wait list for 8 whole weeks. I mean, thoughts and prayers to Dorothy and Sean for that long, extensive wait. So in a nutshell, they're inviting all of these people to come over, kiss their ass, so they accept him into their little mommy community. And thus, Jericho won't grow up to be a loner who has no friends. Leanne, however, is livid. She doesn't feel like it's safe, and she gets pissed off because she wasn't even consulted in the matter. Dorothy apologizes, saying, "You're right, Leanne. We should have consulted you first. And you know what? We won't go through with it if you don't feel comfortable. But we have been chatting online, and I can assure you, you have nothing to worry about. These are mothers and babies, after all." Leanne ends up giving in. Even though she agreed to it, though, Leanne is still on edge from what happened. When the security camera guy comes down the steps to let her know that they installed the security cameras, she feels like he could be an attacker. Everybody who comes in the house could be an attacker. Like, for example, the children's entertainment, Mr. Smiley. I mean, that name isn't ironic. He makes kids smile. He doesn't steal them. But Leanne doesn't know that. The Turners continue to get ready, acting like this is normal. Leanne continues to be weary of everybody. And this little mommy get-together starts off without any hitches. Mr. Smiley puts on a banger of a performance. And in the middle of it, Julian and Vera show up to help out, but not with the party. They help out with Leanne. To put her mind at ease, they're going to man the security camera footage to make sure that no one's there that shouldn't be there. Nothing weird happens. But when they show up, it's like Leanne is even weary of them, or at least one of them. She's definitely leery of Vera. The party continues to rage on, as much as a mommy and me class can. But during it, Leanne is having visions of the group being the Church of the Lesser Saints, who are there to make her pay. At one point, Dorothy has her come in, and Dorothy introduces her to everybody, but Leanne is acting super weird. When the group asks her where she's from, she says Wisconsin, and when they say, "Oh, you're far from home," she just sternly says, "This is my home." It does get pretty awkward at one point when one of the mothers asks Dorothy if she always covers personal matters because she did a story in a drug rehab, and the woman's aware that Julian had a drug addiction. Dorothy is a little taken aback by this comment, but she puts on a good face and just says, it's behind us. But Dorothy gets super uncomfortable when the same woman brings up the fact that she saw an ambulance there. And Dorothy assumes that it was the ambulance in the winter, but the woman says, "No, I'm talking about in the summertime." And that was obviously when the original Jericho had passed away. To her credit, Dorothy just denies, and says, "You must have had the wrong house." It's definitely uncomfortable to the point where even Vera and Julian see it on the cameras. After the uncomfortableness, Leanne is now convinced that some of these moms, if not all of them, are not here for Dorothy. They're here for Jericho. Sean the whole time is saying, "Leanne, you're fine. Jericho's fine. Everybody's fine. Relax." Leanne, however, can't relax. So Sean tells her, "We want to help you, but you got to tell us how." And that's when Leanne tells him about the warning signs, the things to look out for from people of the Church of the Lesser Saints. Like, for example, they're going to wear weird clothes, but it's clothes that they think people normally would wear, although they don't. They also won't eat the type of food that Sean would make. And the big one is they're going to have scars on their back. A little while later, when Leanne is bringing in some chocolate for the group, they're all doing yoga poses. And that's when Leanne starts looking for scars on backs. She doesn't find any until the last woman, and it freaks her out. She puts the chocolate down and runs out of the room, but she runs right into Sean, who is holding blood. He's a pretty bougie chef. It forces Leanne to have to go upstairs and clean up, but then she hears something from her bedroom, and it's a mother who's searching under her bed. Leanne goes into defense mode, demanding to know who she is, what she's doing there, and then yelling at her to get out, saying, "This is my family, I'm not going anywhere." The mother is clearly weirded out. Julian and Vera hear the commotion and run inside and ask what's going on, and the mom says, "Nothing. I was in here nursing my child. I was under her bed because he dropped his pacifier. That's it." They then tell the woman that she probably should go downstairs and rejoin the group. And then Julian has to have a one-on-one conversation with Leanne. Leanne tries to plead her case to Julian that there's something wrong with these women, but Julian isn't hearing it, screaming, "There's nothing wrong with these women. They're just rich. That's it. I mean, look at them. Do they look like they're from a cult?" And even Leanne has to admit, no, they don't. Leanne then stays in her bedroom to cool down a bit. While she's there, though, a bee ends up landing on her hand. She looks over at the wall that is concealing Aunt Josephine's charred body and just starts saying, "This is what you wanted, isn't it? For me to be afraid my entire life. Well, I'm not going to run if that's what you think. I'm going to wait right here for them. I'm going to protect my family. I'm not leaving this house." A little while later, Leanne walks downstairs, but she sees nobody. Nobody except Mr. Smiley. And just like with the woman previously, she goes in the defense mode, figuring that something's wrong, something must have happened. Leanne grabs a knife, demanding to see Mr. Smiley's back. Mr. Smiley's a little freaked out and tells Leanne to calm down, but she starts screaming, "I'll kill you." And that's when all the mothers interrupt this death threat because the moms were just simply outside getting ice cream. Dorothy is especially mortified. All of these women are coming back, seeing this. And Dorothy is really concerned that Leanne is ruining the first impression that the Turners are trying to make with these women. Leanne, however, is convinced that if Mr. Smiley takes off his shirt, he's going to be covered in scars. Mr. Smiley does take off his shirt. He's not covered in scars at all. That's pretty embarrassing. And now it's Dorothy's turn to have a one-on-one conversation with Leanne. She tells Leanne, "I don't know what we could possibly do to make you feel comfortable at this point." But Leanne just mumbles, "Nobody's listening to me." Dorothy, however, takes offense to that, saying, "Leanne, that's all we've been doing," and then commands that she stays up there for the rest of the party. Dorothy then heads downstairs and tries to explain to the women that Leanne is going through a difficult time, and then tells them that they should just forget everything and they have a toast. As soon as she says cheers, however, a bunch of bees come flying out of their chimney, attacking everybody. Forces all the mothers to leave, and the Turners are pretty confused by it. They end up calling up an exterminator, and the exterminator finds a beehive sitting on their flue. The exterminator figures it must have happened when they installed the security cameras, but Sean's a little freaked out because he was standing right next to it and he didn't get stung. As Sean is downstairs talking to the exterminator, Julian is upstairs going over the footage because he is convinced that Leanne had something to do with this. He's going so far as to claim that Leanne climbed up to the roof and dropped it down the chimney. During the explanation, he reveals to Vera that he has this theory that Jericho is actually Leanne's baby that she brought with her. There's nothing on the security camera footage, but Julian is convinced that Jericho is Leanne's child, and she's not content with watching some other woman play mommy. After everybody leaves that night, Dorothy is still in a bit of a state of shock. She just wanted Jericho to have friends, and Leanne is trying to console her, telling her that Dorothy and Jericho have everything they need right there in that house. But at this point, Dorothy is wondering if she's simply... In episode 3, Julian and Vera roll up to the house and they're discussing the whole Leanne situation. They're both pretty convinced that Jericho is actually Leanne's child. Vera does have some expertise in this department because she's a recovering addict who actually had a child and her mother took the child away from her. She tells Julian, the best thing my mother ever did was not let me hold my baby in the hospital. But with Leanne, she's right here watching another woman raise her kid. I mean, what happens if she just decides one day to pack up and leave? Dorothy's going to be looking for Jericho seemingly forever. That's something that Julian hadn't even thought of. He walks in the house and Dorothy is walking out. She's going to a Marilyn Monroe look-alike contest. Sean is in the kitchen getting ready to take Jericho and Leanne to the park. Even though she couldn't make it down the block earlier, Sean thinks she's ready. They're making progress, and before you know it, they'll just be a normal family. Julian then walks up to Sean and tells him, hey, I think we should get Jericho and Leanne's DNA tested. We should probably know for sure if that is indeed Leanne's child. Because if not, then we need to get some adoption proceedings started. The conversation, however, gets interrupted when Leanne walks in the room. A short while later, Sean, Jericho, and Leanne head off to the park, and Leanne is in fact doing better. That doesn't mean, however, her head isn't on a swivel looking at every single person as a possible suspect. To get her mind off things, Sean starts showing her flowers in the park that are actually edible. It does work for a little bit until a homeless teen comes up and asks Sean for change. And Leanne doesn't feel comfortable with the fact that Sean let this person so close to the baby stroller. After that, she no longer wants to stay in the park and they go back home. Dorothy comes home that night, starts ranting and raving about the fact that her job made her go to that stupid Marilyn Monroe contest, and the group heads off to bed. The next day, Julian calls an old friend and meets him in the park. Roscoe. Roscoe has not been doing well. He hasn't been sleeping well. Him and his wife are getting in fights, but Julian honestly doesn't care. He tells Roscoe that he needs him to get Leanne and Jericho's DNA, but Roscoe doesn't want any part of it. He's done. Julian is able to convince him to help out one last time, and Roscoe does know somebody who works in a lab who owes him a favor. So he offers to be a conduit, but he's not going to go in that house and get the DNA. He's going to make Julian do that. As they're wrapping up the conversation, that homeless teen that came up to Sean walks by and catches the eye of both of them. But they just go back to working out. The homeless teen is also in the mind of Sean, who decides to make the kids pizza because they looked really hungry. He heads out to the park, which is literally right behind their house, and he kind of befriends the kids. They just look like troubled youths, and they do enjoy the pizza. But as Sean was feeding the youth of America, Roscoe FaceTimes Julian from a hospital. Roscoe's just visiting a relative. But he tells Julian, I need that DNA now. The guy I know is willing to help out, but he needs it today. It forces Julian to go into the house and sneak around, trying to find any strands of Leanne's hair, but he's coming up empty. As he's looking under her bed, he ends up getting caught by her. He doesn't really have a good excuse as to what he's doing there, so he just says, last week when we were fooling around, I thought I dropped my watch. The issue is, he's actually wearing the watch. That's when he starts lying to Leanne, telling her how he misses her, getting close to her and kissing her, all the while putting his hands through her hair until eventually he just pulls some strands out. It upsets Leanne, and he apologizes for, quote, getting a little too carried away. Julian was unable to get enough hair, actually, to make a DNA sample. He FaceTimes Vera because he's kind of freaking out a little bit. He doesn't know what to do. Vera's suggestion is to grab some of Dorothy's hair. But Julian reminds her the whole point is to prove that it's not Leanne's child. Vera also brings up the point that they probably should confront Dorothy about this because nothing's going to change until she faces the truth. But Julian gets distracted when he sees a text from Roscoe saying, "I'm here." He needs to act quickly, so he starts looking around the house for any strands of Dorothy's hair. Something's better than nothing, right? He finds more than that, though. He finds a full hairbrush. So he grabs all of the hair, and he hands it over to Roscoe to go get tested. Later in the day, Sean is once again trying to feed the youth of America, and Dorothy is asking if that's such a good idea or not. She feels like they're going to come back to him like stray cats. And in a way, she's right, because a little while later, they get a knock at the door from that same homeless teen who asks if it might be he, it might be non-binary, I don't know, but they want to use the bathroom. Sean, just trying to be nice, says, "Yeah, go ahead, it's over there." And the teen walks right by Leanne, giving her a quick glance as Leanne is holding Jericho. Dorothy ends up running into the teen as she's heading to work and freaks out because there's a stranger in her house. The teen ends up leaving, and Dorothy starts yelling at Sean for allowing any stranger into their home after what happened to them. She reminds him they could be casing the place, but Sean's convinced that it's nothing more than a troubled teen looking to use a bathroom. That's it. As Dorothy's yelling at him, though, she suddenly gets inspiration for a story. She calls up her news department and says, "Get everybody to my house, trust me." And she heads out to the park and tries to interview those kids, but they're not talking. She strikes out with the two that Sean had talked to, so she walks up to a third who's on a park bench and starts asking him questions about how he ended up like this, some of the challenges that he faces, and he tells Dorothy that he aged out of the system, and it's been tough because he wasn't able to find help, at least at first, not even for the heart problem. When he brings that up, though, the camera starts glitching. The cameraman brings up the fact that he lost it, and the kid just gets up and starts walking off. But that's when Sean walks in the park, and all three teens excitedly go up to him because they know, all right, free meal. And the news director tells Dorothy that's the story, the Good Samaritan bringing food to these kids. So instead of interviewing the kids, they interview Sean instead. Everybody comes over that night to watch the story, but as everybody's distracted watching it on television, Julian gets the DNA test results back, and Jericho and Dorothy are not a DNA match. Julian knows he needs to confront Dorothy about this. He sits her down and explains that he was there that day when Jericho died, and he wants to make sure that she keeps this child. He then pulls out a piece of paper and says, "I had yours and Jericho's DNA tested. Jericho isn't your baby." Dorothy, as usual, is in complete disbelief, just saying, "Of course Jericho is my baby." Dorothy now thinks that because of this weird conversation, Julian has relapsed. So he repeats, "Jericho is not your baby. This proves that." And while Julian is treating Dorothy like she's a fragile egg, Dorothy is doing the same thing to Julian because she's now convinced that he's using again. This awkward conversation gets interrupted when there's a knock at the door from one of the mothers from the previous day who forgot her diaper bag there. She shows up to pick it up, and that's when you find out that the hairbrush that Julian thought was Dorothy's is actually this woman's. So the DNA test didn't prove anything. He comes clean with Dorothy, and she scolds him, saying, "Don't ever do anything like that again." The whole time, Leanne is watching in the distance. Leanne then heads up to her room, starts playing the piano, but she gets a weird feeling. And when she looks outside, those three homeless teens are outside of her window just staring at her. In episode 4, Dorothy invites Leanne to do a little bar upstairs in the attic. But when Leanne looks out the window, the group of teenagers is growing. She gets a little freaked out, closes the shade, and then goes to work on her core. As they're doing it, Leanne makes mention of the fact she's terrible at dancing, and Dorothy asks, "Why would you say that?" And Leanne tells her, "It's what my mother used to tell me. Whenever I had to learn choreography for a pageant, she wouldn't let me eat dinner until I got it perfect. And I'd try to do my best, but eventually I'd get so tired and hungry that I couldn't get it right." Dorothy feels really bad for Leanne, but she gets called away by Sean because a safety guy has come to their house to assess just how safe their house would be for a toddler. And the answer is not very safe. As they're looking at the kitchen, Leanne comes in and tells them, "You're not going to need any of this. As long as I'm here, nothing will happen to Jericho." Dorothy turns to Leanne to talk to her about the whole situation, but Leanne doesn't even let her get a word out and says, "You need to feed him. He's hungry." The two women go in the living room, and Leanne tells Dorothy, "I don't like that guy." And Dorothy's getting annoyed with the fact that Leanne doesn't really seem to like anybody. She tells Leanne, "He's not one of your creepy cult people. He's owned this company for years." But Dorothy's a little bit distracted because Isabel, her main rival at work, is doing a story for a place that she used to do all the time. Dorothy feels like she's kind of getting pushed out by the news channel. Because of the stress of it, Dorothy ends up lashing out at Leanne. A little while later, Dorothy comes downstairs in probably the scariest thing the show has ever had you watch. I mean, this outfit is horrifically bad. She finds Leanne sitting on the stoop outside, and she says, "We still friends?" And Leanne doesn't respond, but her body language tells you, "Yeah, Dorothy, we're still friends." But then Dorothy gets up and gets in an Uber, because she's headed into work to demand more stories, better stories. So for the time being, it's just her and Sean with Jericho at home. But as soon as the car pulls away, the one teen who was interviewed by Dorothy, who had the heart problem, starts walking up to Leanne outside saying, "I just want to talk to you." And Leanne gets super freaked out and says, "Stay away from me." She really fumbles to get inside, but she is able to. Leanne goes upstairs, grabs Jericho. When she comes back downstairs, the house has yet another new visitor. Her name's Sylvia, Toby's girlfriend, who also works in the food industry and is at the house looking for a job with Sean. Right off the bat, Leanne does not like her. And honestly, neither does Sean. He's kind of annoyed about the fact that Toby brought this girl here looking for a job. He tells Leanne, Toby knows better than this. Leanne then asks Sean what he's got going on, and he says a pain-in-the-ass catering job. But then he realizes he could use some help, but he doesn't want Sylvia, he wants Leanne. Leanne is all for it. Sean figures, Dorothy can just watch Jericho for the time being. But that's not going to work. Later that night, when Sean goes upstairs to tell Dorothy about the fact that Leanne will be helping him out, Dorothy tells him, no, she won't. She'll be watching Jericho. Because I went into work, I demanded a story, and they gave me one. So I'm not going to be here tomorrow. The next day, Dorothy's the one who actually tells Leanne about the fact that she's not going to be working with Sean. Leanne then asks her, when will you be home? And Dorothy says, late. The segment's going to be live, but there's B-roll that we have to get for a party. This really annoys Leanne. She tells Dorothy, it's not good for Jericho when you're out late. Dorothy explains to her, I know you didn't grow up in a house with women who worked, but that's not practical. I love my job. It makes me really happy. Because of that, it makes me a better mother. And if God forbid anything happened to Sean, I could support the household. But Leanne says, I would never let anything happen to Sean. Dorothy starts talking to Leanne about her own goals, about getting her college degree, forging her own path. But Leanne, who is visibly annoyed, turns to Dorothy and says, all I care about is this family. Dorothy doesn't really know what to say and heads off to work. When Leanne does go downstairs, she sees who replaced her. It's Sylvia. And Sylvia has a bad attitude. She thinks she's the little Gordon Ramsay, and she is really bossing around Toby, which annoys Leanne. When Sean sends Toby out to the park to feed the kids, Leanne confronts Sylvia about it, asking her, why are you so rude to Toby? But Sylvia is so thrown off by the question, she doesn't answer it. She just keeps going back to work. And she's actually doing a really good job. She's impressing Sean. But Leanne doesn't stay in the kitchen because Sean asks her to go help the safety guy set up his equipment. And the safety guy is doing that, or at least having his men do it, while he hits on Leanne. It's super uncomfortable. She actually runs upstairs to her room. She was wearing workout clothes that Dorothy gave her, and she didn't really feel comfortable in it, so she grabs some of her clothes. And she starts looking at the wall that Aunt Josephine is hidden behind, which coincidentally has more cracks now than it did before, and she starts screaming at the wall, I guess this is my fault, right? Because I'm dressed like a whore? When she's able to compose herself, she gets dressed up in more Leanne clothing and heads back downstairs, where Sylvia continues to berate Toby. It gets to the point where when Toby goes outside, Leanne confronts him about the fact that he's letting Sylvia just walk all over him. But Toby just chalks it up to, that's how chefs talk. Leanne is really trying to get Toby's attention and screams at him, she doesn't even like you. I mean, all you want to do is live a normal life, and people just assume that you're always going to be there for them as they treat you like crap. That's not fair. Leanne, though, gets called back in the house by Sean because Dorothy's on the phone. Leanne gives Dorothy a quick update and then has her turn on the television to record her segment. The segment is with a graffiti artist, but as Dorothy is interviewing him, Leanne is giving her a death stare on the television. Then, during the interview, Dorothy gets distracted from it and then starts lactating. It's on live TV, so the whole thing is caught. Leanne, though, doesn't care. Jericho is back in the kitchen and crying. She goes to grab him where Sylvia yells at her for leaving a crying child where they're supposed to be working. And then suddenly, the shit just hits the fan. You've got the stressed out environment of a kitchen. The safety guy is trying to wrap up, which Sean has Leanne sign for. And Sylvia is yelling at Toby for spilled ceviche. It's so much sensory overload that Leanne actually leaves the room and sits down outside in the hallway. But back in that kitchen, as Sylvia is ripping Toby, saying how no one should ever hire him because he's an idiot, she ends up slipping on that ceviche and falling. But her ring gets caught on the hook that was being used to make saltwater taffy, and it ends up ripping her finger clean off. Toby immediately tends to Sylvia, but Sean starts yelling, "Where the hell is her finger? Find her finger." And her finger got knocked into the drain. As Toby's frantically looking for the finger, he ends up turning on the garbage disposal. And when blood ends up shooting back into his face, he realizes pretty quickly where the finger is. The only thing left from that finger is the mangled ring which caused the injury. Sean ends up somehow getting it all together, cleaning everything up, and later that night, as he's trying to just decompress, Julian comes over and says, "You gotta see this." And he shows Sean what happened to Dorothy in this interview. At that moment, Dorothy comes walking back in the house, and she looks like someone who knows her career is probably over. She starts bawling her eyes out, and Leanne walks up to her and gives her a giant hug. Once they put Jericho down, Dorothy starts talking to Sean about the whole situation. She explains that when Jericho was gone, she just thought, if I can only have my baby back, I'll never ask for anything. But something just isn't right. It's like the universe is trying to hurt me. I can't explain it. She starts questioning what's wrong with her, and Sean just consoles her. As that conversation is going on upstairs in their attic, Leanne has put on a record, put that mangled ring on her finger, and starts dancing her ass off. And she was lying. She's great at dancing. But as she's dancing her heart out, the group of 3 kids that are standing outside of her window has grown to 9 kids. In episode 5, Leanne is awoken in the morning to the sound of a truck backing up. That's because there's going to be a block party right outside of their house that was orchestrated by Dorothy. She set this whole thing up, but she also put Sean to work. Sean is going to be selling food where all the proceeds go to ending homeless hunger. But Sean and Dorothy won't be the only ones there because Leanne is actually planning to go, which is a big step in her recovery. All these new people are going to be around, but she's going to gut it out and go to the block party. Julian shows up a little while later because he's also planning to go. Vera has a work thing, so he's going solo. And after Dorothy starts poking fun about the fact that Julian can be found at the funnel cake stand, he switches topics to the homeless teens in the park because they've multiplied. Julian makes mention of the fact that there's a lot more than last time, and when Sean says they're just passing through, Julian points out, well, no, they're multiplying because you're giving them gourmet handouts. Before too long, there's going to be a bunch of squatters out here, and your housing value will be kaput. This conversation is really unsettling to Leanne. When the block party kicks off, Leanne exits the house, and it is a lot, but she's handling it well, holding Jericho the entire time. After Dorothy, Leanne, and Julian check up on Sean and his stand, Dorothy starts showing Leanne around. And let me just say, as a person from Philadelphia, this is the bougiest block party I have ever seen. They've got axe throwing. They've got Sean and his gourmet ice cream. They've got a barbecue tent. They've got folk dancers. This isn't a block party. It's a goddamn carnival. But as Dorothy is showing the two around, she sees the News 8 van pull up, and Isabel gets out. This upsets Dorothy quite a bit because she pitched this idea to them weeks ago. And now not only did they not give her the story, but they gave it to Isabel. Both Julian and Leanne try to calm her down, but it doesn't work. Dorothy grabs Jericho and storms right up to the news team. They're a little bit taken off guard, especially when Dorothy basically grabs the mic and says, well, I'm sure you'll want to hear from me, and I'm sure you'll want shots of this and this and this, inserting herself into the news piece. Julian tries to go get the attention of Sean, but Sean, dealing with his stand, tells Julian to back off. After the stunt he pulled with the DNA test, he doesn't really want to hear from him and what he thinks he should be doing. As far as he's concerned, Dorothy's happy, and that's really all that matters. The conversation, though, gets interrupted when a woman named Nancy comes up. And Nancy just so happens to be Sean's minister, because Sean, without telling Dorothy or really anybody, has decided to go back to church. It's a small get-together. It's called coffee hour, but it's been doing Sean a lot of good. And when Nancy walks up, Julian's still there. So he starts quizzing Sean as to exactly what coffee hour is, until finally Sean admits it's just a ministry group. Julian says, this explains a lot. I liked you better when you were an atheist. And Sean shoots back, I liked you better when you were a drunk. Back over with Leanne, she was left alone when Julian went to go hunt down Sean. And she's doing okay, that is, until she sees the homeless teen with the heart condition. She gets super freaked out. He doesn't approach her, he just sits down at a table and starts eating food. But one of the volunteers makes mention to Leanne that she likes helping the homeless and everything, but there's got to be a line. And when Leanne says, is there any chance you can kick them out? The woman is more than happy to do that. She walks up to the teens, tells them that since they didn't pay, they can't stick around, and the gaggle of teens is forced to leave. Leanne's mind is finally at ease, and she can go back to enjoying the block party. Leanne walks by a face painting booth and decides, what the hell, when in Rome, and decides to get her face painted like a tiger. She's making chit-chat with the woman who's doing it. The whole time her eyes are closed. At one point, the woman starts talking about her mother, and Leanne asks, do you still talk to your mother? Because Leanne thinks the woman's still there. She feels somebody touching her face. But little does she know that the woman is not there. And the finger that is touching her face is a dirty one. When the woman returns and apologizes to Leanne for leaving, Leanne gets super freaked out. With half her face painted like a tiger, she leaves the tent and is looking for whoever did that to her. But she comes up empty. Leanne continues to walk around and she sees Dorothy entertaining a bunch of kids, similarly to the way she did it with her back when she was 8 in that beauty pageant. But then she overhears one of the neighbors talking to Isabel about how Dorothy and Sean act like this happy couple, but she's seen at least 2 police cars and an ambulance outside of her house in the last year. Leanne goes and sticks up for Dorothy, saying to the woman, it's not polite to gossip. And the woman says, well, it's not polite to eavesdrop either, and then takes her baby and storms off. Isabel, who was very engaged in that conversation, tries to save face with Leanne by saying, thank you so much. That she wouldn't shut up. Isabel recognizes Leanne from the baptism and says, what was your name again? Leanne what? And Leanne says, Leanne Grayson. Isabel reintroduces herself, saying that her and Dorothy are old friends, and she wouldn't even have the job without Dorothy's help. But then Leanne asks, well, if you guys are such good friends, why do you hurt her? Isabel's a little taken off guard and says, I'm not. I'm just doing my job. And Leanne nods and says, okay, and then leaves. And as soon as she does, Isabel Googles the name Leanne Grayson and finds the missing posters that Sean and Dorothy put out when she went missing. With Leanne a little bit distracted, she totally misses the interaction between Dorothy and Nancy. Nancy, having no idea that Sean has never told anybody he's going to services, walks up to Dorothy and introduces herself as Sean's minister. She tells Dorothy, we would love to see you there too. But Dorothy's more shocked to find out that her husband has been going to church services. So that'll be a conversation she's going to have with Sean a little bit later. Leanne, meanwhile, ran into Toby. They ran out of food over at Sean's stand, so Toby's got nothing to do. So him and Leanne start hanging out, playing some carnival games. Leanne even wins a giant llama. And as they're chit-chatting, you find out that Sylvia ghosted Toby right after she lost a finger. Toby reveals to Leanne that in the end, he knows it was a good thing because that relationship was just toxic. But the more that Leanne hangs out with Toby, the more she's having fun. The night continues to rage on. Everyone's having a good time. And Dorothy finally is able to just sit down and relax for a little bit. And that's when Sean comes up, and that's when Dorothy brings up meeting Sean's minister. She doesn't really have a problem with Sean going, but she does get upset when she finds out that he's been bringing Jericho. She feels like Jericho joining a church is kind of a big thing that the parents should talk about. Sean reminds her, though, that she had Jericho baptized, and he didn't really get a say in that. But in Dorothy's mind, the baptism was all for show. Dorothy says to Sean, keep all the secrets you want, I don't care, but when it comes to our son, I'm going to need transparency. Sean starts to explain that it's not some cult that he joined, it's normal people talking. And if Dorothy gave Nancy a shot, she'd probably like her. Dorothy says, good, because Nancy's coming over for dinner. Sean's very surprised and says, shouldn't we discuss this? And Dorothy says, well, when do we discuss things? And walks off. But that isn't the only secret that Sean was hiding from Dorothy. He got a phone call from the producer of Gourmet Gauntlet, that TV show that he went and filmed in Los Angeles over the summer. They're doing a spin-off on the East Coast, and they want Sean to be a part of it. But Sean doesn't even answer. He just hung up on him. As Sean and Dorothy were having a little bit of a fight, Leanne got hungry. Most of the stands are closed, but she goes into one tent where she hears some pots and pans, and she says, hey, are you guys open? But the more that she goes back in the tent, she realizes it's not a food stand at all, because there's 2 people that look pretty homeless, wearing weird clothes, and they're heating up a dagger. Leanne quickly realizes these are people that are after her. She throws a boiling pot of hot water on them and starts running away. She can't find help at all, and these people chase her down the block, through the Turner's house, and out the back, where Leanne has run into the park. But when she does that, she runs into all of those homeless teens, and she's got nowhere to go. Leanne somehow fights them off and returns home, although she's got blood on her hands, blood on her overalls, and even blood on her head. But she quickly cleans up And as far as the Turners are concerned, nothing happened that was weird. Although when Dorothy does go to lock the back door, she does see blood on the doorknob. Leanne tells the Turner she's going to bed, heads upstairs, and then takes the blood from the back of her head and starts painting her face with it. In episode 6, you find out exactly what happened to Leanne in the park. She was attacked by those people. Her head was cut when they slammed it against a tree, but she was saved by the homeless teens in the park. She was just as shocked as the people that were killed. She was pretty scared and asked, "What do you want from me? I'm not like you." And the one with the heart condition said, "Yes, we know. You said no to him, and you're still alive." Leanne asks, "Aren't you with them?" And the kid says, "Not anymore." So because of Leanne, these homeless teens have turned their allegiance to whoever was in power of the Church of the Lesser Saints, to Leanne. That doesn't mean Leanne isn't still freaked out. The next day, she sleeps in and is awoken by Dorothy, who wants to let her know that she's proud of her. She tells Leanne, "You ventured out, and look, nothing happened." Of course, Dorothy is completely oblivious to what did happen. Leanne doesn't correct her, and Dorothy goes on to check on Jericho. And Jericho is crying his eyes out. Dorothy yells at Sean for abandoning their child, but it's not like Sean actually abandoned Jericho. He got a phone call once again from the people from Gourmet Gauntlet. He stepped maybe 4 feet to the left to take it. He told them this really isn't a good time. So when Dorothy walks in, she wants to know exactly who he was on the phone with and grabs his phone to check. When she finds out that Gourmet Gauntlet called Sean, she gets really excited for him, especially when he tells her that they want him to host because it's coming to Philly next year. Dorothy has blocked out Sean ever going on Gourmet Gauntlet the first time. So for Dorothy, this is a new experience. And she's thrilled. She's really excited for her husband in this opportunity. Sean, though, doesn't tell her about what happened the first time. So it's really confusing to Dorothy when Sean says, "I'm not going to do it. I mean, for the family, I'm not going to do it." Because Dorothy's feeling is, "Sean, you have to do it." She leaves Sean, but she's not done trying to convince him that he needs to do the show. She goes downstairs to garden and has Leanne help her out, and she starts telling Leanne about the fact that Sean's being ridiculous saying no to this TV show. Dorothy feels like it's her duty as a wife to push him into this opportunity. She tells Leanne, "I bet this new minister lady has him convinced that ambition isn't virtuous." And this is the first time Leanne is hearing about a new minister. Dorothy looks over at Leanne pretty surprised and says, "Oh, he didn't tell you either? Sean's having an affair with God. I invited this minister to dinner tomorrow because you got to keep your friends close but your enemies closer." After Leanne wraps up with Dorothy, she goes and has a conversation with Sean because Leanne understands why Sean doesn't want to do the show. And she reassures Sean, "It'll be different this time. I'm here." But while Sean appreciates the sentiment, he tells Leanne, pride comes before the fall. The next day, before Nancy comes over for dinner, Dorothy drags Leanne out to the park. She feels like it's good for her healing process. As soon as they step foot in the park, though, Leanne is super uncomfortable. She actually runs back home and crouches down in the fetal position in her room. When she finally gets up, she goes in the bathroom, looks in the mirror, and just repeats to herself, "You're safe now. Act like it." As Leanne is trying to remind herself that she's not in any real danger, Dorothy is outside tending to her garden when the homeless teen with the heart condition comes in. Dorothy, when she returned from the park, left the gate open, and she's pretty freaked out when this kid walks in and says, "Is Leanne home?" Dorothy, who is pretty freaked out, tells him no. And then the kid asks her, "Can you check?" Dorothy tells the kid that this is private property and tells him that she'll call the cops if he stays. The whole family then gets ready for dinner that night with Nancy. Even Julian's invited over. But Julian is once again without Vera. And when Leanne asks, "Where is she?" he says, "I have no idea. I'm not a mind reader." Julian then asks her, "Is the minister here?" And Leanne says, "No, but I look forward to meeting her," with a lot of attitude. And Julian thinks that Leanne's jealous because this woman is stepping on Leanne's holy turf. Right before dinner, though, Dorothy hears the washing machine go off. When she goes downstairs and checks, she finds the overalls from the previous day, and the blood never came out. Why there'd be blood on the overalls is really concerning to Dorothy. So she goes and checks the security footage, and she sees Leanne fighting with the people in her house, Leanne running through the house, Leanne running out the back, and then Leanne returning. She now feels really guilty about dragging Leanne to the park. As Dorothy is finding out exactly what happened to Leanne the other night, Julian is downstairs, quote, trying to convince Sean that he should go on the TV show. Dorothy put him up to it, but in reality, Julian's on Sean's side. He says, "You can't do this, and you know exactly why you can't do this." There's really not much of a discussion, though, because they both agree on that. There's then a knock at the door, and it's Nancy. It's pretty cold outside, and even though Leanne is really close to the door, she lets Nancy wait a few extra seconds before she answers it. She opens the door for Nancy, but she doesn't really invite her in. She's pretty rude to her. Leanne sits in the dining room, and when Nancy comes in and says, "Are they in the kitchen?" Leanne tells Nancy, "You should stay here with me." A few seconds later, though, Sean comes out and asks Leanne, "Why didn't you come get us?" Leanne just says, "You were busy." Dorothy then comes downstairs, says a quick hello to Nancy, but asks Leanne, "Can I have a word with you?" She asks Leanne, "Why didn't you tell us what happened?" And Leanne's more concerned with the fact that Dorothy's been watching her. She does then tell Dorothy, "I just didn't want you to worry." And Dorothy can't figure out why everybody's so worried about Dorothy worrying. As she puts it, "It's my job to worry." She starts asking Leanne who these people were that chased her through the house. But as she's asking the question, she's figuring out, yes, they were a part of the cult. Leanne tells Dorothy that she's fine. And when Dorothy says to Leanne, "You must be terrified," Leanne says, "No, I'm not scared anymore. I'm just not ready yet." Dorothy asks, "Not ready for what?" But Leanne doesn't get a chance to answer because Julian knocks on the door and says, "You left me out here with Sean and the minister. Can you come save me?" So dinner kicks off, and Dorothy's pretty rude to Nancy. Julian isn't as rude as Dorothy, but he's not much better. But by far, the rudest person is Leanne. She is shooting Nancy death stares the entire time. It's pretty uncomfortable for Nancy. She feels the fact that Leanne, for whatever reason, hates her. Throughout the dinner, though, Nancy inadvertently reveals that Sean was already on Gourmet Gauntlet when the topic comes up. There was a guy at the service who was really geeked out over the fact that Sean showed up the first time, because he watches every episode. And that throws Dorothy completely off. Both Julian and Sean try to cover it by saying that Dorothy has a horrible memory, but it definitely piques Dorothy's interest. Throughout the dinner, Sean ends up apologizing to everybody, saying it's the worst meal he's ever cooked. And Nancy, picking out a hair from her food, says, "So I don't have to eat this?" As she's laughing, it's clearly a joke. But Leanne, stone-faced, says, "Mr. Turner's cooking is not a joke." Sean tries to smooth things over by saying that Leanne is religious, but she says, "Not anymore." When Sean asks, "When did that happen?" Leanne says, "Since I outgrew make-believe." The more and more Susan tries to be nice to Leanne, the more rude Leanne is. Leanne actually goes so far as to say, "I see you, Susan. You're rotten inside." Because Leanne is aware that Susan, before she became a minister, beat on her mother who had dementia. It's something that Sean knows because Susan has told her ministry group, but it's not exactly a well-known thing, and it's nothing that Leanne could have possibly just figured out on her own. So when Susan tells Leanne, "I just want to let you know, my door is always open if you want to talk about anything," Leanne says, "Anything? Really? My secrets and yours?" Susan is getting visibly uncomfortable. She thanks the Turners and tries to leave, but that's when Leanne brings up the fact that Susan probably liked it, as she beat on her mother. Susan starts crying. She turns to Sean and says, "You realize what we talk about in service is private, right?" And Sean says, "Yeah, I didn't tell anybody." But somehow, Leanne knows. And finally it gets to the point where Susan snaps. She yells at Leanne, "How dare you? You judge me." But Leanne doesn't back down at all. When Susan leaves the house, she tells Sean, "Stay away from me." Because of this revelation, Julian hops on the internet and does a deep dive into Susan's name and finds a subreddit thread describing exactly what she did to her mother. He asks Leanne, "How did you know about that?" And Leanne actually says, "I just guessed." She then asks Julian to teach her how to smoke weed. And luckily for Julian, he has a stash hidden away in the Turner residence, so he grabs it, lights the joint for Leanne, and starts teaching her exactly what to do. But that's when the homeless teen shows up out of nowhere, asking if Leanne's okay. Julian screams at him to leave, but he waits for Leanne to answer, and she tells him, "I'm fine. Thank you for checking on me." Dorothy then comes outside and catches Leanne and Julian smoking up and tells them to get inside. After Dorothy puts Jericho down for the night, she hops on YouTube, and she sees what exactly Susan was talking about. She sees the guest spot that Sean did on Gourmet Gauntlet, and she just does not look right. I don't know if it's because she remembers what happened or the fact that she's troubled by the fact that she didn't remember this, but she looks concerned. Meanwhile, Sean went to go have a conversation with Leanne about her behavior, and Leanne's only explanation is, "Nancy sucks." But just like Julian, Sean wants to know exactly how Leanne knew that story about Susan, because there's no way she could have. He says, "I thought we were on the same side here." And Leanne says, "I'm always on your side. Could you be on my side for once?" And Sean right away says, "We are on your side. We're always on your side." But Leanne says, no, you're not. Not like... And she stops herself. Sean tells Leanne that he believes in God, even if she doesn't, because God brought Jericho back to him through Leanne. But Leanne tells him God didn't bring Jericho back. When Sean asks, well, then who did? She doesn't answer the question, just telling Sean to take the job. In episode 7, you find out that Sean did in fact take the job. He, along with Dorothy, Julian, and Leanne, get together to watch the promo for the show. Leanne says it's going to be the most successful season of Gourmet Gauntlet yet. As Leanne is praising Sean, Dorothy cuts in and says, no matter what happens, you were phenomenal, and we're all very excited for you. But Leanne asks, are you though, Dorothy? And it's a weird question that catches Dorothy completely off guard. Leanne then grabs Jericho to take him for his walk. Ever since the incident in the park, she's fine by herself. This frees up Dorothy some time to talk to Julian. She asks Julian, please stop having sex with Leanne. Julian lets her know it's over, but he wants to know what the real root of this conversation is. At first, he thinks it might be work because everything's dried up for Dorothy at work. She's not getting anything. But Dorothy shakes her head and says, no, Julian, somebody attacked her. She says she's all right, but who knows? She then starts talking to Julian about the fact that she can't remember Sean being on Gourmet Gauntlet the previous year. Now it's making her feel like she's losing her mind. Julian, though, just chalks it up to stress. When Leanne finally gets home, Dorothy asks a favor from her. Dorothy doesn't want Jericho anywhere near the homeless encampment. Leanne, however, tells her that there was a danger, but the danger is past, and you don't need to worry about the people in the park. Dorothy thinks that Leanne's falling into another trap for a cult, and Leanne just says, we see things differently, Dorothy. Dorothy then nicely starts talking about Leanne's poor decision-making of late and lets her know that she's made an appointment with Dorothy's OBGYN for Leanne because she found out that Leanne was having sex with Julian. Leanne doesn't agree to go, instead questioning Dorothy on if she's checking on her private things, which would upset her a lot because she wasn't allowed private things with the lesser saints. And Dorothy says, you are entitled to your privacy, we just need to have trust in this house. As Dorothy continues to try to talk, Leanne cuts her off and says, thank you for this conversation, Dorothy. It's given me a lot to think about, and walks out of the room. With Leanne preoccupied with Jericho, Dorothy does have a little bit of time to go snooping in Leanne's room, and she finds her diary. Starts flipping through it, and there's no words. At first, it's just harmless pictures of Jericho, but then you get to some pretty demonic pics. There's even a pic of a severed finger, and then finally there's a picture of Dorothy interviewing that guy as she's lactating. Dorothy is completely disgusted. She tells Sean about it later on, but Sean doesn't think it's a big deal. He thinks that Leanne is doing nothing more than poking fun at the authoritative figure in her life. Dorothy, however, does think it's a big deal. She doesn't want to victim blame, but she's starting to think that Leanne's problems are too big for the Turners to handle. As Dorothy continues to try to get her message across, just like Julian earlier, Sean thinks that most of this is actually because Dorothy is stressed about what's going on at work. It's not, though. Dorothy is merely concerned for her baby at this point. And it's ironic because as those two are arguing, Leanne has taken Jericho to the park to that homeless encampment, where they treat Leanne like a god. Even Roscoe shows up just out of curiosity. He ends up asking the homeless teen with the heart condition, what is it about her? And the kid says, she's extraordinary. She's courageous enough to rebel against anybody who gets in her way. All the while, Jericho is being passed around by homeless people. But it doesn't last long, because when Dorothy looks outside, she sees from her window that some homeless stranger is holding her baby, and she loses it. And for the first time, I actually agree with Dorothy on this one. She runs outside, grabs Jericho, and tells Leanne to get in the house. When they do get back to the house, Dorothy starts ripping into Leanne for defying her orders and taking her son to that homeless encampment. It pisses off Dorothy even more when Leanne just brushes it aside by saying that Dorothy just doesn't understand. The conversation goes back and forth, no progress is getting made, and Leanne continues to be extremely passive-aggressive towards Dorothy. With no other option, Dorothy turns to Sean for help, and Sean says, I'll talk to her, but he doesn't know what else Dorothy really wants him to do. He's not going to kick Leanne out, and as he points out to Dorothy, she was the one who thought that the Turners could rehabilitate her. All Sean really cares about is just enjoying the moment and the dinner that he just prepared, but Dorothy storms off with Jericho. When Leanne re-enters the room and asks where Dorothy is, Sean fills her in and says she's just worried about you and Jericho and the homeless teens. And Leanne tells Sean that the homeless people just want to learn from her. But other than that, they're harmless. The next day, the Turners get a knock at the door, and it's Vera. She didn't come unexpected, though. Dorothy had called her. Dorothy and Vera then call Leanne into the room. Dorothy explains to Leanne that She realized after last night she really hasn't allowed Leanne to experience her independence. She then remembered that Vera has a dance background, and since Leanne has, quote, real talent, she thought she'd be perfect for something called dance semiotics. It's a 2-month class in New Jersey where you get a bunch of training and whatnot. Sean walks in and asks, what's going on in here? And Dorothy tells him, leave or be quiet. But Sean doesn't leave. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out that this, quote, dance semiotics class is a way for Dorothy to get rid of Leanne. Both Vera and Dorothy continue to try to sell Leanne on this class. Dorothy does ask Leanne if she wants to go, but doesn't even wait for a yes. She just books a train ticket on her behalf. Dorothy wants her out of the house so badly that she books the train ticket for the next day. And when Vera points out that classes don't start till Monday, Dorothy says, why wait? As both Dorothy and Sean are getting ready to go to bed, Sean is pretty pissed off that Dorothy did this without even consulting him. But in Dorothy's opinion, it's just not working. She had to do something. The issue for Dorothy is she no longer feels comfortable with Leanne around, and she certainly doesn't feel comfortable with Leanne being around Jericho, which is literally her job. And then there's the elephant in the room. As long as Leanne is there, the cult can come for her at any time. This starts a pretty big argument between Sean and Dorothy because Sean feels like he has no say in his son's life whatsoever, and Dorothy feels like she's just trying to keep her son safe. They head off to bed, but Leanne doesn't. She continues to pack, but she also dances around the house until eventually she makes her way into the basement where she just sits by the pit and stares at it. The next day, Leanne comes downstairs with all of her bags packed. A couple of minutes later, Vera and Julian burst in, and Julian thinks this is a huge mistake. Vera tried to talk him out of making this speech, but he's not going to be quiet. He thinks by kicking out Leanne, Dorothy's being completely irrational. Dorothy then starts banging on the table and says, thank you for your concern, but Leanne is leaving today. That's it. Vera grabs Jericho because he's crying and escorts him out of the room to get away from all the yelling, because Julian is not backing down from this fight. But Vera overhears Julian use her addiction as a weapon against this decision, basically implying that her decision-making doesn't have a great track record. Eventually, through the argument, Leanne says, it's fine, I'll go. She gives a hug to everybody in the room and then steps outside. When Leanne does leave the house, Vera comes back in and starts fighting with Julian about how he used her past history as a weapon. Dorothy walks into the kitchen to grab Jericho, but Jericho's not there. The baby doll is. Right away, they look at Vera because she was the last one with baby Jericho, and she's just as confused as everybody else. The weird thing is, they can hear a baby crying, so they frantically start looking through the house for Jericho. They run down to the basement, but Jericho's not there, and the ground starts cracking even worse near the pit. When they go back upstairs, they hear Jericho crying, but this time it's from the 3rd floor of the house. Vera, Julian, and Dorothy are running around the house trying to locate Jericho. Julian, the whole time, blaming Vera for turning her back on Jericho, but Sean doesn't join them. Instead, he goes and stares at the baby doll, trying to make sense of all this. At one point, Dorothy and Julian start looking around Leanne's room for Jericho. They go to the crawl space that leads you to Aunt Josephine's body, and when they open it up, a bunch of caterpillars come out of it. Right before you figure that Dorothy would find Aunt Josephine's body, she hears Jericho cry, so she runs out of that room. But everywhere she looks, she's coming up empty. The whole time this is going on, Leanne is sitting outside in the rain, not moving. Toby is telling her, Leanne, we got to go to the train station or you're going to miss your train. But eventually she tells Toby, go home. Vera ends up bursting through the door and telling Leanne, if you're as smart as I think you are, you'll get on that train and never look back. Because unfortunately, folks, Vera and Julian, well, they're over. Leanne then re-enters the house, just in time for Dorothy to come running back downstairs. Dorothy yells at Leanne, where is my son? You have 10 seconds. You know what I'm capable of. Leanne, though, very calmly says, he's in the nursery. He's been there this whole time. But Dorothy knows that's impossible. She already looked in the nursery. She then hears Jericho crying and runs upstairs to see if he actually is there. And he is. As Dorothy is clinging to Jericho, Sean tells her Leanne stays. Because if Leanne's here, then Jericho's here. So Leanne's staying. Dorothy thinks this is ridiculous, that Leanne hid their child in some sort of prank. But Sean screams, I'm not losing my son again. He then walks downstairs, brings Leanne's bags back in, and starts apologizing on Dorothy's behalf, telling Leanne that they would be grateful if she stayed. The whole time, Dorothy is screaming at Sean, don't you dare apologize to her. No one, though, is really listening to her. And Leanne tells Sean she will stay and then turns to Dorothy and says, "Thank you for trying to broaden my horizons, but I would never leave Jericho. If I'm not here, anything could happen to him." In episode 8, the homeless encampment is continued to grow. Now it's not just homeless teens, it's adults that are also obsessed with Leanne. And every morning she goes out to address her followers. When she comes back in, Dorothy, however, is very cold with her. Leanne will try to help out, but Dorothy's having no parts of it. She's also not letting Leanne get anywhere near Jericho. Because of that, Dorothy looks extremely run down. It's as if this poor woman has to raise her own child by herself. Thoughts and prayers. Dorothy's also being extremely cold to Sean. She's not even letting him sleep in the same bed. She feels like Sean was complicit in keeping Leanne in the house. So right now, it's Dorothy versus the world. Even when she is offered assignments at work, she has to turn them down because she, quote, doesn't have childcare at the moment. Leanne tries to offer to help, but Dorothy snaps at her and says, "Let me make this as clear as a bell. You will never touch Jericho again." With nothing else to do, Leanne just goes to the park. As she's sitting on a bench, Isabel runs by and recognizes her. Leanne was in the middle of crying about the whole situation with Dorothy, so she doesn't really want to be seen, but Isabel recognizes that face and sits down and has a conversation with her. She tells her that she's had that same face dealing with Dorothy. Isabel doesn't really bash Dorothy, though. She just goes on to explain how Dorothy's a perfectionist. It's really tough to live up to those standards. The conversation makes Leanne feel a lot better. So when Isabel says, "Hey, Wednesday, do you want to grab a cup of coffee?" Leanne says, "Yeah, okay." When Leanne comes home, Sean is hanging a painting with Julian. It's his latest effort to try to get back in Dorothy's good graces. He's doing everything he can think of, including fixing random stuff around the house. But Julian wants to have a conversation with Leanne, privately. He doesn't even get started, though. Leanne comes over with milk and says, "Pour me a glass." And Julian does it. But when the milk reaches the top, Leanne instructs him to keep going, which pours milk all over the counter and the floor. At that moment, Dorothy walks in, sees what's going on, and just has that reaction like, "You gotta be kidding me," and then walks off. After this weird behavior, Julian says, "I'm gonna go now." And Leanne tells him, "If that's what you really want." Upstairs, Sean starts showing Dorothy all the things that he did around the house. But Dorothy sees right through it. She knows it's Sean's way to try to get back in their bed. And doing work around the house isn't enough. Sean knows that in order to get back in their bed, he's going to have to kick Leanne out of the house. It once again starts a fight between both of them about why Leanne is still in the house, with Dorothy wanting her out and Sean saying she brought the family back together. It's difficult for Sean because Dorothy doesn't remember what happened to Jericho, the first Jericho. So in her mind, she thinks the family was fine before Leanne showed up, but they weren't. Sean needs somebody to talk to, so that night he goes and talks to Leanne. He explains that before he met Dorothy, he never really felt alone, even though he was. But when she entered his life, he needed her. And now that he doesn't have her, he feels more alone than ever. All he wants is to sit down, have a meal with her, hold her, and hold Jericho. That's it. In that moment, Leanne simply listening is all Sean needs. The next morning when Dorothy gets up, she's surprised because Sean is still in the house. They've pushed Gourmet Gauntlet a couple hours, so it gives him time to prepare a special meal. Since they missed the premiere of the episode, he figures he can have a small party with the family, and they can watch the second episode together. Dorothy immediately says, "Well, I'll call my dad and Courtney with a K." And that's not exactly what Sean was talking about. He really just wanted it to be very intimate, aka like him, Dorothy, Jericho. It's really it. Maybe Julian. But he has to make a concession to keep Dorothy happy. A couple hours later, after Sean leaves, Leanne is upstairs when she hears a siren, and she goes outside to see what's going on and sees an ambulance that's tending to what looks like a homeless guy on the ground. The homeless guy is awake and responsive, but then she sees Isabel talking to one of the EMTs and then handing him some cash. She then walks up to Leanne, not realizing that Leanne saw her interaction with the EMT, and she tells Leanne that she saw the homeless guy on the sidewalk and he wouldn't wake up, so she's the one who called the ambulance. EMTs say the guy was just dehydrated and he should be fine. Leanne doesn't ask any more questions, just saying, "No, you did the right thing." But she is absolutely suspicious of Isabel. Leanne then invites Isabel in because Dorothy's not there. She's been spending a lot of the time out of the house. Isabel brought some donuts, Leanne puts on some coffee, and the two women chat it up. Isabel is blown away by the fact that Dorothy keeps all of her tapes from every story she's done. But there's one story that catches Isabel's eye. She tells Leanne that it was a story that she actually brought to the table. She got a tip about a mobster getting taken down by the government. She even interviewed the guy in a false story a couple days before. Isabel put the whole thing together, but when she showed it to Dorothy, Dorothy said that Isabel didn't have the clout to sell it. The bosses wouldn't take her seriously, so Dorothy elected to do it for her. In the end, Dorothy got all the credit. Isabel tries to play it off like she's not upset about that because at the end of the day, the story got to air, but she's clearly not happy about it. Isabel then starts asking about Dorothy because she hasn't been at work and they're, quote, concerned about her. She asks if Jericho's okay because they were worried that something happened to him with the whole ambulance thing last year, and that catches Leanne so off guard that she spills her coffee all over herself. When Leanne takes off her sweater, Isabel sees that there's a giant scar on her arm, and she's concerned that Dorothy was the one who did it. Isabel says to her, "I'm not going to push, but if you ever need to talk about anything, I'm here." She then leaves, and Leanne just continues to go about her day. When Sean returns home, he goes downstairs to look for a bottle of wine to pair with the food he's going to make. He finds the perfect one, but he notices that there's sawdust all over the ground. He tries to look inside the wine rack, but he doesn't see anything. Doesn't mean it's not there, though. There's termites infesting that whole thing. Sean just heads upstairs, having no idea about the termites, and continues to try to make the meal. Later that night, Leanne goes and talks to her loyal followers. She holds some kind of prayer service, vigil thing, but at the end of it, she asks two of them what happened today. And they tell her that they have no idea why the ambulance showed up because the guy seemed okay. When they got there, nothing seemed to be wrong with this guy. Leanne then asks, "Did you happen to hear what the blonde lady said to the EMT?" And they didn't, but they do tell Leanne it seems serious. They then hand her the dagger, the same dagger they're supposed to use to kill her, and she gives a speech about how the dagger is what the Church of the Lesser Saints uses to control them. They use it out of fear, but she's not afraid anymore. And then she pricks her finger. She hands the dagger around, and everybody starts pricking their finger, which is unsanitary and, quite frankly, very dangerous. When Leanne returns, she still has the dagger in her hand. And when she opens the back door, Dorothy is in the kitchen watching Gourmet Gauntlet, still trying to figure out how the hell she forgot all of that. It forces Leanne to hide the dagger behind her back. She then heads upstairs and puts the dagger back in the box. The next day, as Dorothy is home, she gets a knock at the door, and she's very surprised because it's Isabel. And we find out exactly what Isabel was talking to that EMT about. The EMT filled Isabel in on exactly what happened the previous summer with Jericho. And now Isabel can get her payback. She tells Dorothy, "I'm going to ruin your career. I know what you did. I don't know how you're not in jail, but you're not going to get away with this." As they're having this conversation, Leanne in the background walks by and sees that they're talking, sees that it's hostile. As Dorothy asks Isabel if she's been talking to Leanne and Leanne doesn't know the full story, Leanne knocks over some pots and pans, which forces Dorothy to walk away from Isabel. The distraction in the kitchen frees up Leanne to have her own conversation with Isabel. She confronts her about if she talked to the EMTs about what happened with Dorothy, and Isabel says, "Yeah, I did. I'm sorry I lied to you, but it was a part of my investigation." She asks Leanne, "Is that your baby? Did Dorothy take that from you?" But Leanne's more hurt about the fact that she feels like Isabel didn't want to actually be friends with her. Isabel starts warning Leanne about how dangerous Dorothy is, and Leanne asks, "Well, what are you going to do?" And Isabel says, "I'm going to expose her. That woman should be in jail." Isabel gets called away for work, and when Leanne comes back inside, she gets confronted by Dorothy. She feels like this is a part of Leanne's petty revenge, but Leanne tells her, "I don't hold a grudge against you." She then heads up to her room and waits for that night's dinner. And slowly the family does arrive. First it's Julian, then it's their dad with Courtney with a K. Dorothy's dad pulls her in the room and asks, "Why the hell is this girl still here?" And when Dorothy explains how she tried, her dad cuts in and says, "That's the problem with you. You've always been too soft. It's held you back." Dorothy tells her dad that she's come up with a new plan. She realizes that Leanne should be sent away. We're talking institutionalized here. She asks her dad for help with this, but they get interrupted when Leanne comes in and offers them an hors d'oeuvre. The family then heads into the living room and gets ready to watch the second episode of Gourmet Gauntlet. But right as it's about to start, Dorothy gets a text message letting her know that Isabel is currently doing a story that she asked her bosses to give to somebody else. She demands that they change over Gourmet Gauntlet to the news, and Isabel is doing a breaking news piece on a shootout in Chester. Dorothy starts saying how this should be her. She should be the one doing the story. And Leanne says, "No, Isabel should be there, Dorothy." And then all of a sudden, on live TV, you hear someone shoot a gun, and Isabel drops dead, having been shot in the head. The entire living room is in complete shock. Everybody except Leanne. Her dad says, "Thank God you weren't there, Dorothy." But the only thing Dorothy can do is look over at Leanne, who has this sly smirk on her face. Episode 9 picks up right where Episode 8 left off. Dorothy is so mortified she goes out back, and Leanne follows her and says, "Are you all right?" And Dorothy says, "No." "What the hell was that, Leanne?" Leanne tells her, "I thought you'd understand." Isabel was going to hurt you. She was never going to stop trying to hurt you. I wanted to help. Dorothy looks at her disgusted and says, help? How? And all Leanne can do is apologize and walk back in the house. When Dorothy walks back in the house, she sees that her father and Courtney are leaving. I guess after watching a news anchor get shot in the head, you're not really feeling up for watching Gourmet Gauntlet. It's 2022. You can DVR it. With Dorothy back in the house, Leanne heads back to the back. She starts looking all over the place for weed. She can't find any. And when Julian comes out, she questions him about it, but he says, I got rid of it all. She then walks up to him and demands that he takes his pants off, which is every guy's dream. That's cool. And they start having sex. She thinks she covered up the cameras so that Dorothy can't see, but she did miss one. And upstairs, Dorothy is watching the whole entire encounter. All 3 minutes of it. The next morning when Dorothy gets up, Sean once again tries to get in her good graces. He asks, what is it going to take to get you to stop icing me out? And she tells him, you know what it's going to take, and you've made your point clear. He then begs to just help her out. Let him hold Jericho while she take a shower or take a nap or something, but she says no. She says no, and then hands the food back over to him that he made for her, saying, I can't eat this. She pours herself a bowl of cereal, but when she takes a bite, there's a bunch of maggots in them. She gets over it, Sean goes to work, and since Leanne has all been but fired, she puts on clothes and gets ready to go out. She heads over to the encampment, and Dorothy is watching from the upstairs room. While Leanne is out of the house, Dorothy puts one of the baby monitors and hides it in Leanne's room. She then starts searching around for Leanne's diary or drawing book, whatever you want to call it, and when she finds it, she snaps a couple of photos of the pages inside. When Leanne comes back, she has a feeling that somebody was in that room. She's even more suspicious when suddenly Dorothy is super nice to her again. But Dorothy wanted to confirm something. One of the pictures inside of that book was of Leanne whipping herself, so Dorothy wants to see her back. She puts Leanne in one of her backless dresses, and sure enough, Leanne has scars all over the place. She asks Leanne, how did you get these? And Leanne explains that she used to punish herself. Members of the Lesser Saints were supposed to be perfect, with no wicked thoughts, no selfishness. But Leanne tells her, don't worry, I don't hurt myself anymore. I don't follow their rules. I get to decide now. When Dorothy gets back to her room, she immediately calls her dad and leaves a message for him to call her back. But suddenly the time gets away from Dorothy. Her phone goes off at 2 a.m, and she sees that it's her dad. When she calls him back, he says, Dorothy, where have you been? I've been trying to get a hold of you all night. And she doesn't have an answer for him. The entire house is pitch black, and she starts hearing something coming from the attic. So she tells her dad, I gotta call you back. She feels like Leanne might be up, so she heads outside to make the phone call to her dad. She asks her dad to send one of his friends, who's a doctor, over to the house to do an evaluation on Leanne. Because Dorothy wants to get Leanne committed. She needs a doctor to sign off on it. Dorothy's going to make the case that she presents a clear and present danger not only to herself, but to others. She's clinically insane. She says, I'll send you the photos, but make the appointment. I'll talk Leanne into talking to the shrink. The next morning, she starts gently pitching Leanne on talking to a doctor, saying how much a therapy session really helped her and Sean in their relationship. She says to Leanne, after the kind of childhood you had, you really should talk to somebody about it. Leanne isn't so sure, so Dorothy asks, what if we did it together? I have been thinking about our relationship. I really want to understand you, Leanne. I want to be close with you again. When Leanne hears that they can do it together, it changes her mind, and she agrees to it. The next day, Dorothy's father's friend, Dr. Mackenzie, shows up at the house. Dorothy gets him set up in one of the rooms to do the evaluation on Leanne. She introduces Dr. Mackenzie to Leanne and then tells Leanne that Dr. Mackenzie thinks it'd be best if they started interviewing each other separately. But that wasn't a part of Leanne's agreement. She really thought that they were going to do this thing together. Dorothy sells it to her with the fact that this will give Leanne the opportunity to speak freely. Leanne is still hesitant, but the doctor's standing in front of her. Dorothy's kind of pushing. She agrees to it. With Leanne in her therapy session, Julian shows up and Dorothy gives it to him, yelling at him that she asked him to not have sex with the nanny, and there he is, having sex with the nanny. Julian tells Dorothy that she simply doesn't understand who Leanne is, but Dorothy is convinced that she understands Leanne better than anybody. Julian tells her, I think it'd be best for everybody if you could find a way to make peace with Leanne. But Dorothy can't figure out why both Julian and Sean are terrified of Leanne. When Julian finds out that he can't talk to Leanne because Leanne is talking to Dr. Mackenzie, he freaks out. He doesn't think very highly of Dr. Mackenzie, and he's mad at Dorothy for getting their father involved in this situation. Julian ends up leaving, but he calls Sean on the way out and says, "You got to get here now. Shit's hitting the fan." Back in the house, Dorothy waits for the session to end with Leanne. When it does, she heads back in and talks to Dr. Mackenzie to see if he got everything that he needed. But he asks, "I still need more background." And when Dorothy starts talking, she sounds like a crazy person. She starts getting animated. It makes Jericho start to cry, and she really has to compose herself. As Dorothy is bawling her eyes out to Dr. Mackenzie, Leanne heads out to the back where the teen from the homeless encampment comes up and shows Leanne a jacket saying it's Milos. Milos must be the name of the homeless teen with the heart condition. She tells Leanne that they found the jacket out front and they can't find him anywhere. This is concerning. Leanne hides the jacket, heads back inside just in enough time to see Dorothy walking Dr. Mackenzie out. Right as he's about to leave, Dorothy's father shows up. He tells Dorothy, "Let's have a little chat." When Dorothy mentions going to get Leanne, Dr. Mackenzie says, "Your father's expressed some concerns to me, but his primary concern is keeping his grandson safe." Dorothy's agreeing with all of it, and when she screams for Leanne, Dr. Mackenzie tells her, "Leanne is not the person I was sent here to evaluate today. The person was you." Dorothy at first has trouble processing all of it. At that moment, Sean walks in wondering what the hell is going on. No one will answer Sean's question, and it's not like Dorothy knows what's going on. So her father has to spell it out for her. "You're not sleeping, you won't let anyone touch Jericho." And then Dr. Mackenzie jumps in and explains that the situation she's in just isn't safe for her or the baby. Furthermore, she seems to have developed a paranoid fixation with Leanne. She starts trying to plead her case, but she sounds even crazier. She also feels completely betrayed by her father. And her father tells her, "All we want is for you to go to some place and rest." It's worth mentioning that Sean is standing there trying to get some clarification on all of this. He's as pissed off as Dorothy. Mackenzie explains that he's legally required to report any situation with a child in danger. He's not going to do that if Dorothy accepts some kind of treatment. But if she refuses help, he has no choice. When Sean tries to step in, Dorothy's father says, "We all know what happened before. You handled it your way, now we're going to handle it my way." That's when Leanne finally comes downstairs. She says, "Sean's right. This is wrong. We can all support Dorothy's recovery. We can do so from right here at home." Dorothy is an amazing mom. She holds this whole family together. Jericho is not in any danger, by the way. Dorothy has no problem letting me hold him. Do you, Dorothy? And this pressures Dorothy to hand over Jericho for the first time in a long time. It gets both Dorothy's father and the doctor to agree to not force Dorothy into some kind of treatment. The doctor does, however, give Dorothy some pills to help her, quote, sleep. She takes it, but she's terrified. And in the season finale, things aren't going great for Dorothy in the house. She's kind of just in a fog. Julian, Sean, Leanne, they're all very attentive to her, but all of those tiny straws are adding up to break the camel's back. Sean and Julian let Dorothy know that she doesn't have to take those pills if she doesn't want to, and her father is not welcome back in the house. Leanne, though, speaks up, saying, "Frank isn't the problem. The problem is you and me. What you tried to do to me, having me sent away, a lot of people wouldn't be able to get past that. But I came here to help you, even if it's not what you want me to do. I need you to stop fighting me, so we can all go back to being a family. I want to start fresh. Dorothy, I forgive you, and I will always forgive you." Dorothy apologizes to Leanne, saying that now she sees she was just trying to help. She won't get in her way again. She thinks a fresh start sounds like a great idea. Sean and Julian, however, don't believe that for a second. They think that Dorothy's planning something. She's just keeping them out of the loop. In Julian's opinion, Leanne is harmless. She would never hurt Dorothy. But Sean says, we really should keep an eye on both of them. Dorothy and Leanne head off and start working out together. But when Leanne leaves the room, Sean enters and asks Dorothy, "Let me in on this. What are you planning?" She ignores Sean's statement and says, "When Dr. Mackenzie said that I could be a danger to Jericho, I looked in your eyes, and you did believe that. I'll never forget that." And then she just walks out. While those two were talking, Leanne decided to do a little spring cleaning. But it wasn't just dust and old things. It was Aunt Joseph's body. She finally decides to get rid of it. Good for her. As she's disposing of the remains outside, Roscoe shows up, and Leanne asks, "Have you heard anything about Milo?" And he tells her, "No, I can't find anything on him." Leanne is convinced that the Church of the Lesser Saints have taken him. That night, in a really weird sight, Leanne gives Julian a bath. Because a grown, able-bodied man has trouble with that sort of thing, Leanne decides to help out. But she asks him, "Do you think Dorothy's real with this?" And his warning to her is Dorothy's not one to suffer injustice. Leanne, however, is willing to put the past behind them. After everybody leaves and Dorothy's in bed, Leanne heads downstairs where she sees Sean drinking a glass of wine, and he asks her, "Did you have anything to do with Isabel?" Leanne, though, says, "I think you've had too much to drink," which Sean points out isn't an answer. But Leanne can tell that something is bothering Sean. He tells her that he thinks that Dorothy's going to do something stupid. But then Sean realizes exactly what he just said and tells Leanne, "Wait, you got to promise me that if she does do something stupid, you won't hurt her." That statement, however, disgusts Leanne. As Leanne heads back upstairs, a painting falls off the wall. But it wasn't some magic created by Leanne. It's because that house is infested with termites. Sean just hasn't figured it out yet. The next morning, Leanne, Jericho, and Dorothy head off for a walk. They decide to head over to the park, where Leanne introduces Dorothy to all of her, quote, friends. As Dorothy is surrounded by Leanne and her cult, Leanne pulls out a piece of paper and lets Dorothy know that Channel 11 is looking for a new morning anchor. The one they have is about to retire. One of the homeless people found this email outside the trash of the TV studio. Leanne points out what an amazing opportunity this could be for Dorothy. This could be all that Dorothy ever wanted. Dorothy doesn't think that Channel 11 will have her, and Leanne says, "They might. I just want to show you, though, we're on the same side." This also shines a light on the fact that Dorothy needs to fire her agent ASAP because her agent should have known this sort of thing. Dorothy's agent shouldn't be usurped by a homeless person. Later that night, Dorothy is giving Jericho a bath where Jericho says his first words, "Mama." But Dorothy's excitement quickly vanishes when she realizes that Jericho isn't looking at her. He's looking at the door. And Dorothy's self-consciousness gets the best of her where she thinks that maybe Jericho had seen Leanne and said "Mama" to her. She has to forget about it quickly, though. She's cooking dinner that night. After she puts Jericho down to bed, she heads downstairs, starts cooking the meal, and has Julian and Sean taste test. Sean is blown away at how good it is, and Dorothy tells him, "You made this for me the week that we moved in." She then has everybody sit down where she brings out a really expensive bottle of wine, and a sentimental one at that. It's a bottle of wine that belonged to their mother, and Julian is dead set on not opening it. Dorothy points out, though, that Julian doesn't really have much of a say. He's sober. And Julian says, "This isn't about me, it's about Mom. As soon as we open that, she's gone." Dorothy's well aware of that. That's why she's doing it. Leanne then weirdly pressures Julian to breaking his sobriety, saying, "Have a glass of wine. You can get back on the wagon again. You've done it before." And Julian says, "Okay, go ahead. Open it up. We all know I was going to relapse anyway." So they open up the bottle and they start chomping on the food. And everybody enjoys a really nice dinner. After dinner, Dorothy goes up and apologizes to Sean. She tells him, "You found faith. I turned to anger. I'm sorry." And in turn, he apologizes. But outside, they have an issue. Roscoe is in the street with Uncle George. And he tells George, "I'll be able to do what we need." George says, "Hush. Her story begins. It feeds on darkness, grows stronger each night. Things are decaying. The house is filled with parasites. Can you smell the rot?" Roscoe doesn't know what any of that means, so he asks him, "What the hell happens now?" And George says, "The end." And it looks like it's going to be the end of Sean and Dorothy. In the middle of the night, Dorothy wakes up and she starts packing a bag. She's planning on taking off with Jericho, but before she can even get downstairs, she's caught by Leanne. Leanne asks her, "Where will you go?" And Dorothy says, "Somewhere far from here." When Leanne asks, "Can I come?" Dorothy snaps at her, "No." Leanne tells her she will follow her wherever she goes. It doesn't matter how far. And Dorothy says, "You can have it all. You can have my husband, my brother, the house, whatever. Just leave me with my child." Leanne then says, "Dorothy, I'm doing this for you." She grabs her and starts yelling for Sean and Julian, waking up the entire house. Sean comes out wondering what the hell's going on, and both he and Julian think that Jericho is in imminent danger. They start trying to calm Dorothy down, but it's just escalating the situation. When Leanne asks Dorothy, "Why do you want to leave me?" Dorothy snaps, yelling, "I'm not your mother. I'm your boss. You convinced these two idiots to believe you, but I don't. Just let me go." Dorothy is backing up until finally she has nowhere to back up. She's against a banister. Leanne says, "I'm sorry." And then all that termite damage causes the banister to break. Dorothy throws Jericho up. He is narrowly saved by Leanne, but Dorothy crumbles 3 floors down, and Dorothy is severely injured. And that is the end of Servant Season 3. Thank you so much for checking out this recap. Please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit thumbs up if you like this. Smash that thumbs down button if you thought it sucked. Put your theories for Season 4 in the comment section. Do you think anyone's going to die? I'm on the fence with that. I never thought Leanne would actually hurt Dorothy because of how much she cared for her, but yeah, I was proven wrong on that. So I'm interested to hear what you people have to say. Also, I have merch. Go buy a bag. Go buy a t-shirt. I'm not a celebrity chef. I'm also not a D-list reporter. I don't have that kind of money. I have bills to pay. So you buying a t-shirt, that would be helpful. But just know, I really do appreciate you guys checking out this recap, and I can't wait for Season 4.